I've learned over the years when in Texas, uh, especially when doing education in Texas, you should always start with the teaks. Always go right to the source. So I know this is a little scary. It's like lots of teaks thrown at you. Another veteran of Humanities Texas, Joe Kabilka, a professor at SMU, always likes to say that, he didn't graduate from PowerPoint school, so he's allowed to do things like this, and, share way too many words on a screen. And I guess I was a PowerPoint school dropout as well. The reason that I do this is to show you, as if you need to know, just how often the Declaration of Independence shows up in the Texas standards. By my count, there's 8 direct or indirect references to the Declaration of Independence, including a very special one that's for this week. I believe this is Freedom Week, yes, in Texas. And during Freedom Week, your students actually have to recite part of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, line that we're going to look at very closely tonight. So we have, I don't know, the stars are aligned. This just seems like the perfect time to do all of this. And so what I'm going to do mostly in this talk is talk about the making of the Declaration, how it came about, and then we will dig right into the text in the second half of the program, look at how it's organized, answer any questions you have about particular lines or anything in it. All right, first though, it's not a party unless you have even more teaks. And this slide points out a lot of the other founding documents, you might call them, from the colonial period, and even older English history. So we have Magna Carta that goes all the way back to 1215, the English Bill of Rights, 1689, the House of Burgesses in Virginia, which is founded in 1619, the Mayflower Compact, 1620, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, 1639, just all these, all these documents. It's incredible. I mean, I confess in my, early American history class at the college level, I don't get to all of these documents in very much depth. And, we're not going to talk about all these tonight, although I'm happy to answer a question about them. But I wanted to list them because in a very real way, the Declaration is participating in this longer tradition of recording rights and really, organizing societies that, goes back, all the way to the Middle Ages in English history. At the same time, the Declaration was doing something quite different, and that was creating a new country, something that none of these other documents had done. And we're actually coming upon the 250th anniversary of the Declaration and that country it created, the United States, which will happen in 2026. And we're getting old enough that I think it's pretty easy to take all of this for granted. And so if you've attended one of my sessions before, my standard public service announcement is to not assume that anything is inevitable in history. In fact, I consider inevitable the worst swear word in history. It's so bad, it has 10 letters, not just 4. So we want to avoid that word because we want to think about instead a better word that has 11 letters, contingency, the way things came about, why they happened, how they happened. Those are all our tasks as historians and what we want to do with our students. So with that spirit, let's kind of walk through the steps that led to the Declaration of Independence. One of the teaks talks about the grievances and thinking about the grievances and how those are reflected in the Declaration. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and what I think was the #1 grievance, which was the war with Great Britain. But if we go back to the period after the French and Indian War, the 1750s, Britain began passing a number of laws and enacting new policies to govern its American colonies. And there's so many, I think it can be overwhelming. So what I like to do, and what I do in my textbook that Murphy mentioned, is organize them by different crises. So you have the Stamp Act crisis, came first in the 1760s, followed by the Townshend Acts crisis, and finally the Tea Act, or Independence crisis. That one didn't get solved except by the creation of the United States. And one thing that all of these crises had in common was a tax of some sort that the British passed. And so I think it's pretty easy to just attribute the American Revolution to taxes. And we even have a great rhyme for that, right? No taxation without representation. And for obvious reasons, you have to teach these taxes and that phrase to your students. But one thing I want to stress tonight is that the Declaration was about much more. It was about giving consent to be governed in any sort of way, any type of policy that might be created by a government, not just taxes. And so it doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but I think the phrase that produces the Declaration was no legislation without consent. And we're going to jump into this narrative after the Tea Act, after the Boston Tea Party, after the British passed the Coercive Acts of 1774, and the first Continental Congress, which took place in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. I mentioned that it wasn't inevitable that these different colonies were going to become a new country called the United States. And one illustration of that is that this first Continental Congress, more of the delegates had actually traveled to London than had been to Philadelphia. There wasn't a lot of unity between the different colonies. And so among other things, one thing that the Declaration of Independence did is it really began this process of inventing America and what America was going to mean. So we weren't quite there yet in 1774, though. Let me show you what happened in this first Continental Congress. The delegates came together. The British didn't think this would happen because they thought, gosh, none of these colonies care about Massachusetts. But they all saw the writing on the wall and they thought, well, if the Crown can treat Massachusetts as poorly, it can also happen in Virginia or New York or South Carolina. And so they decided to have a united boycott against British goods. And this was called the Continental Association. They also came together to state their position in terms of their relationship with Great Britain. And you see that phrase that I mentioned earlier, no parliamentary legislation without consent. And that's a concept that we really associate with Thomas Jefferson, who would later be the main author of the Declaration of Independence in a pamphlet that he wrote earlier in 1774. So they're saying, Britain, we don't want you to do anything for us unless we say it's okay. And then Congress went ahead and said, we give you permission to do one thing, and that's to regulate our trade. We'll be part of the British mercantile commercial system, which was known as the Navigation Acts. So the Americans still saw some financial benefits to being part of the British Empire, but they decided that Parliament no longer governed their affairs, that they only recognized the authority of King George III, and they petitioned the king for some relief. So let's take this story across the Atlantic and see what King George here said. Well, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert. There would be a second Continental Congress because King George didn't even want to receive, he refused to even receive this petition from the Continental Congress. And his response was this. He said, I am not sorry that the line of conduct now seems chalked out, which the enclosed dispatches thoroughly justify. The New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. So blows must decide. Very, self-fulfilling words, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so the boogeyman that we see as the king in the Declaration of Independence, is an exaggeration. I think, Jefferson and Congress made George look even worse than he was. But it is important to know that he was a hardliner, that he really was, I guess understandably interested in keeping the colonies part of the British Empire. So I actually think the depiction in the musical Hamilton, although it's obviously fictional and done for comedic effect, is not that far off. King George did want to keep all of his subjects. So he said, blows must decide. And he dispatched troops to Boston to basically quell that rebellion that had started there. And that led to the famous event of Paul Revere and other writers in Boston going out to the Massachusetts countryside to warn them when the British were finally on the march. And of course, that happened in April of 1775, when the British marched to Concord, Massachusetts, to get a munitions store. And Paul Revere rode out to the countryside. And the way that we remember this is that, he said, the British are coming, the British are coming. But we have very strong evidence now that that's not what Paul Revere would have said or what he said. He instead would have said, the regulars are coming, the redcoats are coming. Because even at this late date, spring of 1775, the people that lived in America still consider themselves British. They hadn't adopted this term American, very much. They thought of themselves as South Carolinians and New Yorkers and Virginians and maybe Bostonians. But it took a while to have this title of America. So if Revere said the British are coming, all the farmers out in the fields would have said, Paul, relax, we're here. You need to calm down, man. But we know that that warning, whatever he exactly said, was honest. The British were coming, and it led directly to war. The battles of Lexington and Concord in the spring of 1775. And when you teach this, the reason for American independence, I think we often overlook the most obvious cause of independence, and that was the war itself. I have a high school daughter who likes to play with me a little bit with the terms correlation and causation. I'll say you could have done a lot better on that test if you maybe would have spent less time with the earbuds on and watching YouTube or whatever you're doing. And she said, well, don't confuse it. That's not a cause of why I did bad. It's just a correlation. I said, well, maybe it's a cause. And in this case, with the American independence and the war, I think it's definitely a cause. And we'll see that in the document when we get deep into it. And I think there's a lot of causes. I don't think there's any single cause. I think the taxes are certainly a cause. The other British policies, the Proclamation line of 1763. But the war is the thing that finally pushes independence. And we see this in a lot of different ways. The war spread from Massachusetts and actually went up and down the East Coast. The Americans even invaded Canada. That's never a good idea in American history. It's kind of like invading Russia in European history. It never ends well. But this had the effect of spreading the war and really angering the colonists even more against King George. That's exactly what happened in the colony of Virginia, where this handsome man, John Murray, who was known as Lord Dunmore, was governor. And you have likely heard of something called Dunmore's Proclamation of November 1775. This is a proclamation that Dunmore puts out because he's so desperate, because he's fighting this war all of a sudden, and he was outnumbered. And so he wanted to really get at the colonists where he thought it would hurt them the most. And what did Virginia society and Southern society depend on, more than anything else? And he recognized it was slavery. And so he offered freedom to enslave people that would come to the British side. And he only got around 800, maybe 1,000 people at most, and didn't treat them very well. A lot of them became sick. But it was a really important moment because it pushed a lot of Virginia planters who were kind of on the fence about whether to support independence to go all in. And so this is one example of how the war really, expedited independence. We also see this on an individual level. This is a letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote to his best friend in London. So I guess it's like it's BF to his BFF, William Strahan, who was also a printer. He was a member of Parliament, and Franklin wrote this letter in July of 1775, and it's devastating. If you want to give your middle schoolers and your high school students, devastating breakup letter, and maybe they don't need that, but if you share this, I think they'll be impressed. Franklin wrote, "You are a member of Parliament, and one of that majority which has doomed my country to destruction. You have begun to burn our towns and murder our people. Look upon your hands. They are stained with the blood of your relations. You and I were long friends. You are now my enemy, and I am yours. B. Franklin." Geez. So this is an example. Benjamin Franklin had spent much of his adult life in London with people like Strahan, but he came home in the summer of 1775 and discovered the war. And these words that he wrote really echo in other people's writings of the time. You can see that he didn't send this to Strahan. He kept it in the draft box, right? He slept on it. And we don't know exactly why he didn't send it. He might have decided it was a little bit too strong, that he didn't want to completely, break off this relationship with his close friend. We also think that he kept a copy of the letter because he wanted to prove to other patriots that he wasn't a loyalist, that he wasn't loyal to King George III because he had written this devastating letter to his friend. So it's a really interesting case study, but we'll see similar words show up actually in the Declaration of Independence, the way the war was described. So let's go ahead now to the Second Continental Congress. One important decision at the First Continental Congress was that if King George didn't answer the petition favorably, they would meet again in the spring of 1775. And so that would turn out to be May of 1775. And that's after the war had started. So the Second Continental Congress begins as a war Congress. And you can see that this lasts until March of 1781, kind of a strange date, but that's the date at which the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified, something we'll talk about with Woody Holton next week. And that ends the Continental Congresses. There's no third Continental Congress. It just becomes Congress after that. So in 1775, these are the things that the representatives in Congress did. Kind of like today, we see this a lot in the world where two sides will be fighting each other, but also negotiating peace at the same time. That's kind of how the war between the American colonies and Great Britain began. Both were pursuing war, but both were also trying to find some means of reconciliation. The British idea for reconciliation was known as North's conciliatory proposition. And this is Lord North, who was the British Prime Minister at the time. And he basically told the colonies, he said, okay, so you don't like us taxing you, we'll let you raise revenue on your own, as long as it meets the demands and the needs of the empire. And this proposition might have solved the crisis, in the 1760s, maybe even in the early 1770s. But at this point, it was rejected because it was still an example of what was known as parliamentary sovereignty, the idea that Parliament could rule and determine the affairs of the American colonies. And remember, the number one thing they wanted was their own consent to be governed. So that's rejected. By the way, on Google Classroom, which Murphy mentioned, you have these slides. So I think taking notes is always a good thing, but also just know that you have a copy of this waiting for you. So the Americans come up with their own plan of reconciliation. It's known as the Olive Branch Petition. They send this in July of 1775. John Dickinson, a delegate from Pennsylvania, is the leader. And it's again to King George. And they basically say, we're still loyal to you. We'd like to find some way out of this. But George again rejects the petition. So that emboldened the radicals in Congress. And so at this point, there's still loyalty to the king, but it's definitely weakening. And you're starting to see some growth and emergence of that term, America. and Americans. Up to that point, the people who had used that term were actually the British. The British had called the colonists Americans, while the colonists have thought of themselves as British. But that was beginning to change. But there's a real stalemate. It's not really clear where this is all going. And at that point, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. And this was a great Enlightenment pamphlet that encouraged the Americans to pursue independence. Thomas Paine was from Britain. So in a sense, he understood that society, even better than the American colonists. And he talked about how absurd it was to have a monarchy. Why would you have someone rule you that got that position just by accident, by birth? And so Paine, made a lot of other logical examples. Why would you have an island rule a continent? And so on. And so this was the most widely printed publication in the American colonies, except for the Bible, second only to the Bible in terms of the number of copies printed, close to 200,000. And lots of people read, each copy. They're left in coffee houses and taverns. And it basically said, publicly, what people like Benjamin Franklin, Sam Adams, Jefferson had begun to think privately, and that was, we need to pursue independence. So we get to 1776, and it's important to note that the American people in many ways were ahead of Congress. Between April and June of 1776, there were 88, close to 90 local declarations of independence that were written. These are by different towns, communities, in some cases organizations, and they were encouraging delegates in colonial assemblies and also at the Continental Congress to pursue independence. And the number one reason they cited was the war. So Congress finally started moving. And in the middle of May, 1776, they advised all the colonies to start to form their own new governments. And this was the creation of the process of writing state constitutions. And those were incredibly influential, basically turning these different colonies into individual republics. And they'd eventually influence the US Constitution, which is going to be our founding document in the third week of the series. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution for American independence. And I'm going to read it because I think you'll recognize these words. Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. It might sound familiar because those words are at the end of the Declaration of Independence. But Congress decided that that wasn't enough, that if they were actually going to pursue this, there had to be a written declaration. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One goes back to that Anglo-American tradition of writing down, different rights in the documents that we talked about before. A good example is the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which followed the Glorious Revolution. And it listed all the problems with the previous monarch, King James II. And so I think they were envisioning something like that. And so they created a committee to produce this document that Congress could then look at, debate, and perhaps approve if they were going to pursue independence. So the committee that they created, sometimes known as the Committee of Five, are all right here. And you can see them from left to right. We have John Adams, Roger Sherman is the gentleman seated next to him. Robert Livingston is standing, Thomas Jefferson, and then Benjamin Franklin. And so this is kind of a 19th century imagining of how this committee actually worked. And in truth, it mostly worked with one person, and that was Jefferson by himself. But he did come together with the other committee members who offered different edits along the way. And so it's interesting the way that, Jefferson became the lead author. He was only 33 at the time and not as famous as several of the other men on the committee. In some ways, the most obvious choice would have been Benjamin Franklin, who was the most famous American at the time. But Franklin was a famous editor, and editors don't like their own words to be changed. And he knew that whatever was produced, Congress was going to revise in some way. So Franklin made some key edits. I'm going to read a line that I think might sound kind of familiar. "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." That was Jefferson's first draft. When Franklin got a hold of it, it became, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And those are the words for Freedom Week. And in making that change, Franklin actually introduced a whole new school of philosophy. There was something at the time known as the Scottish moral sense or natural sense philosophy. And the idea was that as humans, we just know certain things. They're just self-evident. And Franklin inserted that. Roger Sherman, the second from the left, he was a statesman from Connecticut. A big fan of the musical 1776. A fun teaching tip, you can show your students some of this in song through that. And there's a song in which he said he was a bad writer, that he does not know a participle from a predicate. He was just a simple cobbler from Connecticut, which was not exactly true. He was a pretty successful lawyer and politician, but he did like to stay in the background. Robert Livingston, who's standing in the musical 1776, he gets called back to New York because his wife was expecting a baby. The actual reason he got called back to New York is that New York couldn't decide on independence, and they needed him there, to help to make that really important decision. So it came down to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Adams was Jefferson's senior, and in some ways, could have taken control of the process. But in a rare moment of humility, Adams was a very vain person. In a rare moment of humility, he decided it should be Jefferson. And later he listed 3 reasons for that. And one was he was so disliked by other people in Congress, he needed somebody else to write this. People are also tired of Massachusetts complaining about their treatment by the crown. So it'd be great if a Virginian like Jefferson could write it. And finally, Adams said that Jefferson was 10 times a better writer than he was. And that's actually quite true. So as I mentioned, Jefferson was only 33 at the time. This is one of our earlier paintings that we have of him. And in writing the Declaration of Independence, I think you should think about it this way, and maybe this will be a useful way to teach it. We think of it as one of the great primary sources. It's called one of the charters of freedom, along with the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And so, of course, it's a primary source. But in writing it, Jefferson, in his own mind, I think almost kind of thought of it as a secondary source in the way that he was drawing on everything around him. He was really creating a synthesis of different events, things that had happened, and also different schools of philosophy. And he described this later, he described his process and what he was trying to do. And he said that it was intended to be an expression of the American mind. He's really trying to capture everything that was in the air, by the mid 1770s. And so a lot of books have been written about, what's the most influential thing in the Declaration of Independence and the greatest influence on Jefferson. Was it the natural rights theories of John Locke? Was it the English opposition tradition of the 17th century and the 18th century? Was it the moral sense philosophy that I just mentioned that came out of Scotland? Was it the French Enlightenment? And I think that the answer today that scholars have come up with is yes, that it's all of these things that Jefferson is weaving together. And that's why it's such a masterful text. It's a masterful synthesis of all these different ideas. And somehow he's able to make everything very coherent. And it becomes in itself an Enlightenment text. And why is that? Well, during the Enlightenment, reason is emphasized. And I think above all, the Declaration tries to be a very reasonable document by laying out all of this evidence of why the Americans had decided to break free from Great Britain. So before we get into the text, let me just point out a few things to kind of get us ready for that. The first is a fun image from the Library of Congress from a few years ago. Some of the preservation scientists there did a digital scan of the Declaration in one of Jefferson's drafts. And we read a transcription of one of Jefferson's drafts for our session tonight. Well, in the original version, he made a mistake. Throughout the Declaration, when he refers to the American people, he calls them our fellow citizens. And that's really critical, because who lives in a republic? Citizens. But he had been a colonial subject his whole life. And so in one line, you can see at the very bottom of this, he actually wrote our fellow subjects. And you can see that he realized his mistake. He began to erase it. And he also wrote over the word subjects and turned it into citizens. I love this. I think it's a great teaching tool to show your students that they're making this, right? You can see it. You can see it happening. You can see the laboratory. And in a very, very real way, they're inventing what America is going to be all about. America is a strange nation in the world, especially at that time. The nations of Western Europe had evolved through history, usually because they were based on a common language and ethnicity and often religion. America was quite different. It wasn't based on just a single people. It was based on this set of ideas that were being gathered together in the Declaration of Independence. Margaret Thatcher, who was the British Prime Minister in the 1980s, put this really well. She said, the nations of Europe were created by history. The United States was created by philosophy. And I think it helps to show the different ways that these different countries came about. So this little slip up, that this little CSI moment that Jefferson had here came in the grievance section of the Declaration. And one thing we're going to talk about when we get into the document is that scholars are actually focusing the most on the grievances now, not necessarily those soaring words that your students recite during Freedom Week, but the nitty-gritty of the different reasons that the Americans decided to break away from Great Britain. And scholars have determined that it's not just random, that there's a logical order to the grievances. And we'll talk about this, but the most important point is that the key grievances come last. The last 5 grievances all have to do with the war that King George and the British had waged against the American colonies. And this is like the closing argument of the Declaration. And you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because if we go back to this idea of subjects, the whole point of being a subject of the crown is the crown was supposed to protect you. You pledged your allegiance to the king and he protected you. Well, George was doing the exact opposite by making war. And so the very last grievance has got a lot of scholarly attention in recent years, and we'll be talking about this. I think it's often glossed over, but the 27th grievance is this: he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So, this is not the part of the Declaration that we recite at July 4th picnics or during Freedom Week. And this helps to show how this is also a very political document, that this is trying to persuade people at the time to join the American cause, and using whatever base reasons it could. And in this case, quite racist language about Native Americans. And I have this is a quick chat quiz. Who or what is Jefferson referring to when he says he is George III, but he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us? what are the domestic insurrections that Jefferson is referring to? Does anybody want to type in the chat real quick, and we'll see if we can get that in. If not, we'll reveal the answer in the second part. But it's a really key phrase that goes back to something we've actually talked about. Good guess. The Tea Party is a very good guess. Think about the war, and he's talking about Lord Dunmore. Dunmore encouraging enslaved people to leave their plantations and come over to the British side. And so this document that we rightly celebrate for its amazing language about human liberty and human freedom also has, in some ways, this statement, almost supporting slavery. And so it's a very complicated document. There's a lot of things going on. Well, let me get to the end of the story here. We haven't even published this thing yet. We're still writing it, but we're going to publish this now. We're going to talk about how it came about. And this is an example of one of the original printed versions of the Declaration. A printer in Philadelphia named John Dunlap printed about 200 copies. And I love this. He did it in the middle of the night, July 4th into July 5th. So America is literally created by an all-nighter. He's churning these things out. And this is one of the examples that are left. We know of 26 copies today. And, I think that we have to emphasize kind of those rough politics, like I just did at the 27th grievance. We also have to, celebrate the amazing language about universal liberty. And I think that's the really redeeming thing about the Declaration, is that it talks to future generations. And when Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, I think it's fair to say that he has in his mind that really probably all white men are equal. But other groups that were marginalized at the time seize on that language. This is actually alluded to in the Teaks, which I think is great, that the Declaration lives on throughout American history. So the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights in 1848, the document that they released, called the Declaration of Sentiments, says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. We can think about the Gettysburg Address. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln quotes Jefferson, says all men are created equal, except in that context, Abraham Lincoln actually means all men, white and black. The Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, Martin Luther King quoted the Declaration often to really hold it up, almost like a mirror to, white American society, to say these are the values, of the founding. And so it's incredibly radical, I think, incredibly progressive. And in some ways, I think the story of American history is trying to catch up with these words that show up in America's founding document. So I'll stop there so we can actually look at the document. First, I'd love to, hear your questions.